Have you ever wanted to get out of automatic settings on your camera and didn't really know how or what any of those numbers meant? Well, that's what we're actually going to talk about today here at Might Sound Wild. How's it going, everybody? My name is Matt, and welcome to the Might Sound Wild YouTube channel. We are so excited about all of the things that we have coming up to resource you and challenge you and help you turn those wild dreams into a reality. And one of those things that's going to help you, for those of you that are trying to get better at photography or take it from just being a hobby or something you do with your kids or for your family, to a way to make money, is actually knowing, learning, and being able to use each of the settings on the camera to get the photo that you pictured in your head. Now, when you're talking about camera settings, there are three main components to setting your camera that's going to help you get that image that you're wanting. And one of those is aperture, the next being shutter speed, and the final one being ISO. Now, I'm not expecting you to know everything about each one of those things. Honestly, I don't know everything about each one of those things, but I actually do have a degree in photography. Yeah, it's crazy. People can do it. They can get degrees in such things. And one of the first classes that we had was Photo 101 class, 101 class. And one of the main reasons for the class is to do just what we're talking about today, to go through settings to allow people to learn what ISO, shutter speed, and aperture is. And one of the very first things they had us do is they list out each one of the aperture numbers and shutter speed numbers and ISO numbers in one-stop increments. And we actually had to learn each one of those numbers. But to simplify it a little bit, I want to tell you a little bit about what aperture actually does. Now, if you look inside the lens of your camera, the aperture is actually a series of blades that kind of contract and open up depending on the number that you set it to. And so if you have your f-stop or your aperture set to f2, for example, your the blades in that lens are actually going to open up really wide because you've set it to f2. And if you have it on f16 or f22, it's going to close it down really, really small because you've set it to f22. Now, the way that I like to think about it, really, the way that I like to visualize aperture, because as artists or photographers or creatives, we're all visual people, or a lot of us are visual people. I like to think of it as a shield. Aperture is the shield for your sensor. And so if you set it to a low number, you're allowing a lot of light in. Or if you set it to a high number, you have more shield value, so to speak. You are allowing less and less and less light in. Now, in order to understand how that really affects your image, you have to understand ISO a little bit. So let's talk about that. ISO is simply how sensitive your sensor is to light. So if you put it on ISO 100, for example, you're telling your sensor, there's a lot of light around, and I don't need you to be as sensitive. But if you put it on 1600 or 3200, 6400, or if you have a Sony camera, most of them can go to like 1,000,000 or something like that. But those ISO numbers are going to be only valuable to you if you have a very small amount of light. You're going to tell your camera sensor, like, hey, there's not a lot of light around, and I need you to gather as much of that light as possible to hopefully try to get an image. There are a few things that get affected when you put your ISO at 100 versus 1600 or 3200. The higher the ISO, the grainier, the more noise you're going to have in your image. And so, like with shore shooters or mountain escape, we actually tell our photographers, go ahead and set that ISO number to the smallest number that you can make it, so that we can have the sharpest and crispest, the most crisp image that we can have while shooting our families, because that's what they are wanting. That's what most people want, unless you're a documentary photographer or whatever. But if you're putting it at 1600 or 3200, like I said, you're going to have a lot of noise. So when you couple that with Aperture, your shield, so to speak, if you have a very, very sensitive ISO or a very sensitive sensor like 3200 or 6400 or whatever, when you go out in broad sunlight, broad daylight, you're actually giving your camera some conflicting information by setting the ISO really high. You're telling it, there's not a lot of light, I need you to be really sensitive. So in order to compensate for that, you're going to have to turn your aperture up, or the shield for that sensor up, to a really, really high number, and you're going to lose some depth of field if that's what you're trying to accomplish. But vice versa, if you go outside and you set your aperture to 100, you're telling your camera, there's a lot of light out here and I don't need you to be so sensitive. You can go ahead and let the shields down a little bit, because there's plenty of light for everyone. But then you get into shutter speed. Shutter speed is simply how fast you want the secondary shield, so to speak, in your camera to open and close. Think of it like a levee or a dam. You're blocking off that light from the sensor, even though you've set the aperture, you've set the ISO. You're blocking off that light from the sensor, and you're telling it, in order to grab the information in this image, I only need it to be 1/15th of a second, or 1/30th of a second, or a 60th of a second. But those variables are also going to cause you to make a decision, whether you have a person running in your image, or whether you have a really windy day, or whether you have a still life or a landscape in front of you. The ability to choose a shutter speed that's appropriate for what you're wanting is going to be crucial. Now, shutter speed can go from 1 second on most cameras to 1/4000th of a second. That 4,000th of a second, or 8,000th, or if you have digital cameras, it can go even higher than that. Those shutter speeds are telling your camera's shutter, in order to grab light or make this image, I need you to be really fast, or I need you to be really slow. Now, 1 second is actually telling your camera that maybe I want a large depth of field in my image, and there's not a lot of light, or there's a fair amount of light, but my aperture's up so high, so I need to compensate for those variables by allowing more light in for more time. Whereas 1/4000th of a second, or 1/8000th of a second, or 1/3200th of a second is going to allow that same decision to be made, where you're saying, hey, I've got a ton of light, I've set my ISO to 100, I have my aperture wide open, or f2 or 1.4 or 2.8, and because I want a very shallow or narrow depth of field, I want to isolate a subject from the background, or I want to cause a little bit of a focal point in the image. for that person or that thing. And so because of all those variables, I need my shutter to be really fast. Now there's another variable that we use a lot as shore shooters of mountain escape, and that is, or one decision actually, is that's when we're shooting people, we don't want there to be a lot of blur happening, because there may be a moment, or we're trying to shoot a traditional family portrait, or we're trying to, like I said, capture that moment between a father and a daughter, or mom and a son, or mom and a husband. And we need that shutter to be fast. And so what we use as a rule of thumb is we don't want to go under 1/200th of a second, because what that's going to do is it's allow us to capture images quickly, but also keep the shutter fast enough to where when it's baking the image into the sensor, it's not going to take a lot of time. And so those are some of the things that we can learn about aperture and shutter speed and ISO. I know I've given a lot of examples as to what shutter speed numbers you should use, or aperture numbers, or ISO numbers, but really what it comes down to is you getting out there and playing around with it, you going out there and experimenting with it and seeing, when you make a decision, what does that do? How does it affect your image? And so a couple of things that we can walk away with, because I know I gave you a lot of information, and if you need to, go back, watch the video. But really, aperture, you can think of it like a shield. The lower the shield number, the more of the light you're going to let in. The higher the shield number, the less light. But also it's going to affect you in two ways. Remember, it's going to be, if your number is low, you're going to have a more narrow depth of field. But if it's higher, you're going to have everything in focus. You're going to have a really large depth of field. And then shutter speed, the slower or the lower the number, the longer your shutter is going to stay open, and the more time it's going to take to capture that image. The higher the number, the cleaner the image is going to be, because you don't have motion blur or camera shake that could affect how sharp that image is. And then the last thing is ISO, how sensitive you want your camera's sensor to be. And most of the time I'm going to start my camera making or image making decisions with with aperture, really, because that is going to determine a lot of the other things. Like most of the time when I'm photographing people or moments or candids or lifestyle images, I want my shutter speed, or my aperture rather, to be narrow, because I want to point out those specific moments that I want a viewer of that image to see. And then usually I go to ISO and then shutter speed. But all of these things kind of play in tandem and work together. But like I said, you just have to get out there and try it. You have to figure out what is going to work and what is going to be best for you in a particular situation. But that's it. That's all I have. But if you like this video, go ahead and hit the thumbs up button. It helps us out a ton. And go ahead and subscribe to the channel. We're really trying to get to 100 subscribers by the end of the year. And you are the ones that are going to help us make it happen. Thank you for watching this video, and go out there and follow and chase your wildest dreams.